Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Raymore City Council work session for Monday, February the 18th. We have one major item on our agenda tonight, which is annexation, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Fearborn.
Thank you, Your Honor. I would once again want to introduce Corey and Christina here tonight to, their first task was to, in essence, come up with, based on the council's discussion with them at the last work session, come up with logical areas of annexation. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to them to make presentation to you all.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor and members of the council. Thank you for having us, and I appreciate it. I'm going to distribute now a memo. We'll have two that'll go around. I'll start with the first one. At the work session in December, you may remember that we presented an annexation area, 3 areas for your review and contemplation. And at that time, there was an inquiry as to whether we may look at extending the borders north towards Missouri 150 Highway. And so with that direction, we started to look at it and discovered that the cities of Grandview, Kansas City, Missouri, and Lee Summit, Missouri have extended their borders south to the county line, which is the northern border of Raymore. And so they encompass all of that area from Raymore to 150. And so those 3 cities each individually have their boundaries straight south. And so with that in mind, from a practical perspective, having a northern border of Missouri Highway 150 for the city of Raymore would likely be opposed by the residents that are there. The way that this would be done is it's a statutorily prescribed process, and so the Missouri 71.011 prescribes a procedure, and the procedure is pretty basic. The cities discuss and come to an agreement. Each will adopt each will adopt an ordinance. Within the ordinance, they will describe the property that they wish to de-annex and annex, and go through the process as a regular annexation would go. The issues you will find is that each city is going to have different interests, and the council members are going to have their own interests, and then there's residents that will be in that annexation area. And part of the issue there is that if they, under the statute, if they object, it immediately goes to a vote and goes to court, and that's going to be a big process. Kansas City, in particular, has a history of not de-annexing area, especially if it's primed for any sort of development in the future. And we actually have had direct experience with that with one of our clients, in which we were trying to de-annex and annex land for a developer, and it was met with consternation, to say the least. And I think there was some other words that Christine may be able to remember, but essentially it was that they were just not open to any sort of annexation.
And what's important about that example that we experienced, it was at it was related to a project called Paragon Star that was at the intersection of I-470 and Buhigh. So it is on that western part of the city. It is in District 5, the City Council District 5, which would be the district we would be dealing with at this location here. And in that process, all we wanted to do was take 95 acres, half of which was a side of a hill, and the rest of it we were just going to put sports fields on and a parking lot. And so because the Paragon Star project has 120 acres within the city limits of Lee Summit, another 95 acres north of Lee Summit in the Kansas City city limits, we thought, wouldn't it be great if we could get it all into one city? The city manager thought it was a great idea in both cities. The Planning Commission even gave us an approval in Kansas City. But when we got into the council level, the neighborhoods and the council district members said no, that they would not allow us to do that. That we were. That we weren't telling the truth, that we were going to have all this development and they were going to miss out on all the sales tax. And so the citizens in that area in District 5 pressured the elected officials, that really pressured the process to such a degree that we said this isn't even worth it, and we withdrew. So they're pretty, if there is a potential for development of any kind, I think you're going to find that Kansas City's District 5 folks are going to push back pretty hard.
And so with that in mind, turning to the city of Lee Summit, for example, a portion of the annexation that would occur if we were still looking north towards Missouri Highway 150 would be the subdivision of Raintree, and that subdivision has been there since the 70s, and I would imagine that it would be met with significant opposition by both the residents and the city. And then you have the city of Grandview, and they are actually also considering a sports complex that's going to be developed in Grandview, and that, while it doesn't directly meet the northern boundary of Raymore, Kansas City would oppose, likely, with an eye on the development piece again, any sort of annexation that would be entered into with Grandview and Raymore. So even if with those things in mind, if the council wishes to proceed, you can do that per the statute that has been listed in the memo. I apologize. And the application of this statute would require some of the following tasks. You'd want to identify the residents that exist within the proposed annex area and their interest and appetite for any annexation. And a lot of times those people may have residency requirements if they live in Kansas City and work in Kansas City. You'd want to gain understanding and desire of the appetite again. And the law only speaks to residents, so the potential for precedent-making and therefore costly litigation does exist and may be right as to actual property owners as opposed to, for vacant land, as opposed to residents that just live on the land. There's engineering that would need to be done to determine the infrastructure needs in that area, and planning to increase the service demand on both Public Works and the police if you consider to go east to 291 as well as north. It's that much more area to cover, and that's that much more of a cost increase on that type of annexation. Additionally, we need to obtain approval from each city council, proceed with this process, and agree on the area to be de-annexed and annexed, and pass the ordinance necessary to complete the process, which would include certain members of each city losing a portion of their district, which is probably not an ideal situation. So all of that taken together, we recommend that Raymore does not focus on moving north towards the Missouri Highway 150 and exclusively focuses on moving east towards 291 south. And at this time, we'd be happy to answer any questions.
Jay, go ahead. I know you had, I was getting ready to probably say the same thing, but I'll let you go ahead and speak to the problem.
I appreciate your background and information on this. However, I think your look at this was a broad scalpel approach of everything to the north. That was never our intent. What we were looking for is a singular outlet to 150 Highway to improve our transportation plan. And I would have to respectfully disagree with your findings. I think that there is a potential, if the MARC project to extend Raytown Road from the south down to our border at 155th, Kansas City may very well be interested in that. Now, all we would need is enough land around that road to take the road. We're not interested in taking a whole bunch of people or anything in economic development land, just enough to stay within the legal confines, because if you look at the outlets from 155th to 150, they're all in horrible shape. They're all either under the control of Grandview or Kansas City, and Kansas City in particular doesn't have enough money to keep up on their streets and infrastructure as it is, as evidenced by the fact that they are agreeing to a de-annexation and annexation by us on 155th Street. So while I don't disagree with your findings in general, I think the broad scalpel, yeah, Raintree is certainly not going to let us annex, and that was never our intent. What we meant, and perhaps we didn't state that properly, Councilman Barber and I feel very strongly that there is an opportunity for us to take a road that we can maintain easier and to better standards that would connect to 150 Highway. It benefits both Kansas City and it benefits us. I'm not saying it's an absolute thing, but I think as opposed to the broad swath that you've come up with, that may be a possibility.
Yeah, I was pretty sure that that's where Jay was going to go with that, because we were all kind of looking at the the three roads. You've got Kelly, Peterson, and Kurzweil, or Horridge Road, and we had even talked about the extension of Raytown Road as a possibility, because if it were to go north from its intersection there at 150, it's potentially mostly rural or agricultural properties that could then connect up to the county line road. So for purposes of a thoroughfare for our residents to get to 150 in a much easier fashion, we were looking at a much smaller swath of land for potential de-annexation, annexation that could then be maintained by the city of Raymore. That's kind of where we were going. I think you guys put a lot more into it than what we were really looking for, and that's fine, because I had the same position as you did on all those properties. It wasn't going to get done under your explanation that you had here. So, but you've heard from Mr. Holman. I think Mr. Barber echoes those sentiments, as do several members on the council. And so, and maybe if there's some way for you to kind of draw that in to see of a potential there for that kind of stretch out to 150, to give our residents a much greater opportunity for entrance and egress from that direction, that might be something that you could refocus on. I don't know that that's part of the overall contract, since you've already put so much into it here, but that would be, I think that would be a majority of our interest with regard to this particular topic.
But Mayor, may I ask a question?
Sure.
then? So, but you're still looking at inquiring of Kansas City, Missouri to do it?
It would be. It would be an inquiry with Kansas City. We've already had those discussions in the past. You know, we briefly opened the door with the County Line Road project, and so it's not insurmountable. It would be harder, but it's not insurmountable, and that's why we were interested in that potential.
Absolutely, and we can certainly continue to look into that and narrow the scope. When we, and I apologize for not exactly picking up on what you had mentioned at the work session, and understanding that you have the narrower view of just getting the ingress and egress. There will be the issues of compact and contiguousness and 15%
Sure.
of the city, so we would need to engineer that, and it's something we can certainly, with the direction of the council, look into and work with staff on that if we would need to.
So,
And your articulated reasonableness to the approach is to, I think it might be helpful if we can continue this conversation with this next memo, because there are some criteria that determines whether the area that you're describing is reasonable. And so we'd have to articulate what it is you're trying to achieve. And it sounds like what you're trying to achieve is a controlled access for your citizens to get to Highway 150. That's pretty succinct, but.
It also improves the transportation plans for people coming into our city as well. Raytown Road is a major thoroughfare coming south all the way, and it currently ends at 150. That's why it's on the MARC transportation plan. It's an unfunded plan in the capital project right now. Am I correct, Mr. Townsend?
I believe so, yes.
Unfunded and not set within a specific year, but the project is on their books.
yes.
Simply building that road just doesn't, it adds to their infrastructure maintenance cost. And they've already shown that they can't take care of the south end in particular like they would like to, hence they agreed to the de-annexation of 155th on the north side.
Okay, so I'm going to give you another piece of information, not to be argumentative. In the example that I gave you of the de-annexation of the 95 acres, in the long-term master plan for the city of Kansas City, they wanted View High Drive to go up. They want View High to go all the way up and connect in a parkway fashion to be managed by the Parks Department up through the land that we were trying to de-annex. And in exchange for the de-annexation, or as part of the de-annexation process, we actually offered, I forget now, at least $6 million. It might have been as much as $8 million towards the construction of that road that would never otherwise ever be built by the city of Kansas City because they don't have the financing to do it. And that was one of the reasons why the staff was so excited about the de-annexation process, because they thought that that was a great give. I mean, because again, all we want to do is do a sports fields and sports activities, and maybe a trailhead, that kind of thing. And even with that $6 million capital improvement, that would then not be, they wouldn't have to pay for, but they would have this their long-range transportation plan connection. That was not enough to carry the day with the elected officials. Those are related to the de-annexation question. So I'm just saying that infrastructure alone for district was not enough to carry the day.
Go ahead, Jay.
Do you think, though, I mean, if I were a council member in Kansas City and you brought this project to me, I'm good with that, but what I can see them thinking is, you're talking about an economic development here, half of which is in our city, and you want us to give it up, and all that sales tax is going to go to Lee Summit. That's not the case here. We're talking about unimproved farmland south of 150 all the way to 155th. Most of it's owned by the Efforts brothers. There's not going to be any economic development there, and if Mark puts that road in, all that Kansas City gets out of that is additional maintenance. That's it. They get nothing out of it. We would gladly take it, and we've shown, like I said, there's been a cooperative project. I'm not saying it will happen, but I think your scenario is comparing a little bit of apples to oranges, because I could see that. We're not giving up our 95 acres of economic development. They're going to build a huge complex, and all those tax dollars are going to go to Lee Summit.
It was not a huge complex, and it was 95 acres, 46 only, and 46 of it was flat enough to develop on, and on the flat land that was going to develop it, the most we would have been 3 sports fields and a parking lot. So I just want to make sure, and it was vacant land that is on the tax rolls for less than $3,000 a year.
Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Fearborn, did you have something to add?
So, to clarify for me, 15% has to be touching Raymore.
That is correct. Of the annexed area, the area you're seeking to annex, 15% of it has to touch current city boundaries. So if you're going north to 150 from a current city, or from current city road, you're going to have a pretty significant swath of land. Not having done the engineering, and we just haven't gone that far yet, we can look at it and what it would take to make a 15% contiguous, compact and contiguous run at that. We would be happy to do that, and we have our engineer, Dan Miller, who would be more than capable of doing that to figure out what that would look like, and could bring that back to you for sure, if that's something that the city council would be interested, as well as staff would direct us to do.
And that's a lineal 15%?
That's correct.
Got it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's.
Sonia, did you have something? I saw you had your hand up. Sorry.
Thank you. I was just curious, when this project you're talking about, when was that? Has that been last year? Thank you.
Anyone else before we go to the next memo? Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you again, Mr. Mayor, and thank you very much for the input. I appreciate it. So for the second memo you will be receiving, this is regarding the annexation area east of the current city boundaries of the city of Raymore. Taking the guidance we received at the work session in December as well, we started to look at the involuntary annexation procedure and what it would take to extend the boundaries east towards Raymore. You are all probably familiar generally with what that process looks like, and that it needs to go to a vote of the people. You've heard the terms compact and contiguous and 15% over and over again. And so the requirements, the threshold requirements that we look at anytime we start to look at annexation, we're going to look at, and we're going to see maps distributed now for a bigger version of the maps
Last page
of Exhibit A on our memo. So the threshold question that you always look at is whether the area is compact, contiguous, and meets 15% of the city boundaries. So what we have proposed is one large annexation area that extends east, generally east from the current city boundaries of Raymore, all the way to 291 South, and it meets the southern borders of Lake Winnebago and Lee Summit, Missouri. So as the procedure moves forward, we have our statutorily prescribed process that we would follow. And the first official step, as I said, would be that a city or governing body would pass an ordinance, and that ordinance must include a description of the land to be annexed and state that such annexation is reasonable and necessary to the proper development of the city, and that the city has developed a plan of intent to provide services to the land that's to be annexed. Understanding that we're suggesting a fairly large area of land to be annexed, that's a consideration that's going to have to be taken into account by the council as to whether you can immediately or within 3 years, is what the statutory time frame is, provide adequate services to the areas that are going to be annexed. The standard of review applicable to this decision when it goes to court is that substantial evidence will show that this was a reasonable and necessary annexation, and that it is that's fairly debatable. So in other words, you can have one person say this is a reasonable annexation, and somebody else can say that it's not. And if we are there, then we're where we want to be. So the temperature is warm. So a variety of factors are to be considered in determining whether an annexation decision is reasonable. And just a few you can read, so I'm not going to just recite the entire thing, but a need for residential or industrial sites with the proposed area, whether the city is unable to meet its needs without the expansion, consideration of the needs which are reasonably foreseeable and not visionary. All of these things, it's a whole host of issues, and they're not exclusive. This list is not exclusive that you find in your memo. There are several other things. But one overarching consideration that courts have consistently applied is squaring off city boundaries, which is what you'll see in our proposal. You'll notice that you'll have a north-south boundary line that would run along Missouri Highway 291 South, and an east-west boundary line that would run along East Hubach Hill Road. And then to the north, the newly formed Raymore City boundary would contact the southern boundary of Lee Summit, as well as portions of the county line of Cass County and Jackson County, Missouri. It's likely that if an annexation was attempted in this area and it was to be challenged, that a court would find as our approach reasonable. It squares off the city boundaries. It meets 15% contiguous requirement. It's not arbitrary. It's not capricious. It is a gold standard style annexation. In addition to the goals that were outlined by city staff and the mayor and city council at our last work session, we wanted to extend the boundaries east to the intersection of Missouri Highway 58 and Missouri Highway 291 South. Excuse me. This annexation area would provide tremendous opportunities for the city of Raymore, allowing it to grow both residentially and commercially, especially at that intersection. There's a prime real estate for commercial development there. It allows you to more uniformly enforce your building codes, extend police protection to the annexed areas, and enhance the value of both the annexed area and the city. And the benefits of such an approach would also include the application of the city's desire to expand that intersection and absolutely encompass what I believe was attempted at the last annexation as well, and perhaps a smaller version of it, but that's, I believe, is what the idea was. And so there's a recommendation that the study area identified as Exhibit A, or the larger map that you've been handed out, be recommended by the mayor and city council, and it meets the threshold issue of compact and contiguous as defined by the statute and makes the boundaries of the city more regular. At this time, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
So, go ahead, John.
I don't disagree with what you put here, but I guess one of my questions would have been, given the defeat last time, is this too big a chunk to bite off? The main piece I think most of us really want here, we're going to cut away everything, run the line across there and the line either there or there. That's the key piece. Do we jeopardize getting that if we try and take all this little chunk to the south and this? If so, I'd rather try and get what we think is more important economically, more important from a transportation standpoint, the school sets out there. Now, if you all think, you're the experts, yeah, this is doable. I understand the argument, it squares off our borders. This is more of the panhandle effect, if you will. That's probably my really only question with what you've got here.
And that one is actually for me, sir. In staff debate regarding this issue, want to remind the council what our short-term goal is with the annexation, and that's to block others from coming to this area. That's our first goal, because it is staff's view that it's going to be very, very difficult in light of other items and other projects that the council has in place to actually go for an actual plan of intent and to move forward with an annexation effort until at least late 2021, possibly 2022. In the meantime, we want to we are in hopes of coming to Lee Summit and Winnebago and achieving MOUs with both of them that they recognize this is our area and they won't encroach. While just declaring the area, thank you. While just declaring the area is an important step, we are not statutorily guaranteed that they couldn't come down. Now, the court would look at that and recognize that we were the first ones to declare the area. But it's not necessarily a guarantee that the court wouldn't go, if they passed an ordinance and said we're going down, that the court wouldn't side with them. But an MOU with them would give us a legally defensible argument that they couldn't come down. We'd come to an agreement. They'd said, we won't come down. We think we've got some really good arguments with Winnebago. We promise we won't cross 291. And if they want to come down the east side, that's great. And so the intent would be we get rid of the current intent to annex areas. We get rid of the old plan of intent just to make things clean, and then we pass at the same council meeting this particular intent to annex, and then we establish 2 MOUs internally, have Mr. Zur write those, and then we go before the folks from Winnebago, we go to the folks from Lee Summit, we make our best case, and we try to get an MOU with them in the short term. In the long term, there are areas that this is the logical area for that purpose. Declaring this as the plan of intent area, similar to declaring a TIF area, does not mean that you have to go for all of these areas when you actually make up the plan of intent. And in fact, we might be recommending to the council, based on the 15% rule and compact and contiguous, and maybe we don't want some of these areas, so we got to kind of hopscotch around. We may actually have 2 or 3 plan of intent areas over a period of time and bite this off. And what our consultants understand is my recommendation when we get to that stage would be to go from the middle out. In essence, 58 Highway, and then out from there to the north specifically first, and then come down south. Again, the school district, once we get the middle area, can always come in, even if we don't take them. Seem to be the most logical baby step approach, if you will, to doing this, but our first goal being come to an agreement with Winnebago and with Lee Summit.
And in our conversations about that, the idea of the energy that could start getting generated ultimately may provide opportunities where if it gets developed out, you know, to a certain extent, you know, that point of where all of a sudden some of the properties that are not as valuable right now and are more troublesome may become more attractive for redevelopment and essentially be purchased and bought out. So, I mean, that's a long-range thought and a long-range vision, but it starts with a step.
Yeah, I would agree.
And the northern one of the, oh, I'm sorry. The northern one of those properties that was just brought up is not as problematic as the southern one, because we have to always give them access to the county without blocking them off and making them an island. So we're working on, we're drawing on pieces of paper on what those logical areas are to go for.
Okay.
But that's where the development will happen first, too. So if you take that centerpiece, you're going to get some energy going in the center first, close to that southern piece.
Sure. Yeah, I had always envisioned that, you know, we had this broken down into 3 areas when we initially talked to you, and I had envisioned that you potentially would come back to us and let us know that 1s and 2, the furthest north 2 sections, with 58 being the southern boundary, might be a more appropriate area to try for potential annexation. But Mr. Fearborn just explained that this is our intended area, and that we can then roll it back to an area, should that be the actual area of concentration that we pursue for annexation at a given time. So I see that as a much more manageable, and I understand the intent MOU with all those different entities as well.
And the teams that would go to Lee Summit and the team that would go to Winnebago would be a little bit different. We've even gotten as far as discussing who would be in attendance in those. So.
Okay. John, did you have a question? I saw you. Okay. Mr. Circo.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, I agree. Like we talked before, I think our main intent has got to go east 58 to 291. We need to work toward the north a little bit because we got the roads like the mayor said, but definitely, I guess we can put the intent down here to the south, but really not deal with the south or expand too far to the south. That kind of hurt them years back. I think staying in the main corridor and working toward what would be profitable for the city north, and the south will take a while to develop anyway. And I think if we get too far and try to bite off more than we can chew, which happened last time, it came back to bite us.
Well, actually, the problematic, Tom, if I could stop
Yeah.
you, the problematic area was going east of 291.
Oh, going farther
It
past.
wasn't going south, it was going east of 291. So that, the areas that we have now, which are delineated by the red line, keeps us just to 291.
Okay, yeah, this one here goes as far south to what?
Hubach.
Hubach, okay. I think before one time they want to expand and that caused
That
some-
wasn't part of the area initially, though.
Okay.
When
I
our
mean,
plan 12 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, they had 3 segments, but I know. But anyway, I think that's the main function. You got to stay to the center line, work toward the north, and you can spread, but I don't know, we won't have to take it. We can just propose it and then squeeze it down to whatever we felt necessary for the city and what we're going to financially take care of and what would help our budget for the city, so we wouldn't be over expanding ourselves to something we couldn't handle. But, all right, thank you.
Mr. Holman.
Thank you. Mr. Fearborn, I just want to make sure that I understand your comments correctly. So as we look at this now and the map that is in front of us, we would go from the general to the more specific as this plan goes further deep. We would basically, if you will, in other words, announce to our neighbors and partners, this is our future sphere of influence. And we would not be required to take the whole thing at once in an annexation. We could narrow this down and go piece by piece or strategically as needed. Is that a correct statement, sir?
That is correct, sir.
Okay.
And in fact, if you wanted to, there are a lot of different ways to get that elephant down. You could do one annexation effort, just like we did last time, with 3 or 4 different areas. You could take that center corridor and then a year later go to the north, a year later go to the south. A lot of different ways to do that in time and what's ripe right at that point in time.
Is there an expiration date if we declare it an intent to annex?
There's not, I'm sorry if I may speak to that, Mr. Councilman, there is not an expiration because the resolution you'll be passing is just generally speaking to the desire of the city to move north. And something that Christine had brought up when her and I were discussing this is the potential to amend your comprehensive plan with an eye on annexation. You could be an appendix, you could be an amendment, you could do however you want to with your planning commission, but that's another way to drive home the plan of the city and what it intends to do. And so there would not be an expiration because this is not your plan of intent as much as this is your intent area. And so the plan of intent that Mr. Fearborn had mentioned would be meeting the statutory requirements, but smaller sizes and what makes more sense for the city.
John?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I also agree with the assessment Mr. Fearborn made. I'd like to ask the question also, if we did in fact, and I don't think that we should, but if we did take this entire area as proposed by Bushy Head, how big of a strain would that be on city resources for us to handle that?
That's next steps, sir.
Okay.
Yeah, when we get to the point where we are doing a plan of intent, we have to prove up all of that. We have to,
Okay.
Every single department is turning in tons of information on it. How many more police officers are we going to need? How many more public works personnel are we going to need? All of that. How much iron are we going to have to put out on the street? All that sort of thing.
I think it strengthens the argument that you make that we should just take a small section in the middle, what we need, and then add from there. Thank you.
Anyone else? Do you guys have anything else to add to that?
Not at this time, Mr. Mayor.
Okay. Jay, did you have something else? No, I'm good. Okay.
It would be, if it's all right then with council, we will be taking 2 steps. We will be getting on to your first meeting in March with killing the old plan of intent and intent to annex area, and immediately behind that on the agenda, having this new area proposed. And we will continue, that does not preclude us from continuing the research on going north on 150 and finding out how much that 15% is and a logical area that we would actually be taking with that. Originally, that road that was proposed actually curled and hit Kentucky Road. We probably would run into significant legal issues because you're walking right through a whole bunch of Kansas City employees' yards there. So we would probably, it's probably going to have to come further east and connect up with Fox Ridge Drive directly. So we will also be figuring out the infrastructure needs that would be associated with connecting it to Fox Ridge and how much that's going to increase traffic there.
Okay. Great. Well, if there's nothing else, that kind of concludes your presentation for this evening. We appreciate it very much and all the hard work
Thank you
you've
very
done
much,
so
Mr.
far.
Thank you, members of the council. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you. And I don't believe we have any other business on the agenda tonight. So at this time, the meeting's concluded. No.
If I could ask the council to just stay for just 1 second for a personnel announcement to you all. Can you ask David if we're off?
Excuse me.
No. This is the